It's an absolute honour to be here on the land of the Gumatj, the Yolngu people, on this very sacred country that is Gulkula. I want to give my gratitude and pay my respects to the Gumatj people who have been so incredibly humble to welcome all of us here to teach us all again at Garma. I want to recognise their continuing connection to lands, waters, communities and cultures, and pay my respects to elders past and present, and my deep respect to the ancestors of this country. And I also want to acknowledge all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in the audience here. Thank you for your hope, your persistence with us. Thank you for your resilience. Thank you for continuing to share your wisdom in places that sometimes do not heed your wisdom. Thank you for persisting when sometimes, despite all the words of change, it can feel like there is no change. And you may predict that that is an issue that will be very resonant in my presentation today. My name is Nat. I'm a Balanda woman, a white fella. My people escaped genocide in Eastern Europe, and we escaped to this country to freedom. I escaped to privilege in the suburbs of Melbourne, but all the while knowing that while I got to escape genocide, there was genocide that had occurred in this country. I acknowledge that I come from a place of privilege while I'm talking to you today. In all the things I say, I haven't lived the heart of the issues that I am speaking about. I plan to give you the key messages of an Australian-wide review that the Productivity Commission has done into government progress against the National Closing the Gap Agreement. We've just issued a draft report, and many of you will see a little QR code for that on your seats. We are really hungry for your feedback. This is not a first and final report. This is what we have heard. This is what we understand to be the case and what we're proposing going forward. Please have a look. Tell us whether you agree. Tell us whether you have different views. You may wonder what the heck the Productivity Commission is doing in a space like Closing the Gap. And actually, the Productivity Commission has been in the reporting space against life outcomes for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in Australia for about the last 20 years. Some of you might remember the Overcoming Indigenous Disadvantage reports. And then as the Closing the Gap agenda started, we started producing annual data reports. We were kind of like the data instrument to hold governments accountable. The new agreement in 2020, it's a 10-year national agreement on closing the gap. It's the first one that wasn't just signed by governments around Australia. It was signed with a coalition of Aboriginal peak organisations. That one tasked us with reviewing progress every 3 years, and this review is the first of those 3-year reviews, and shortly after this one, there will be an Indigenous-led review. You might think of us as data wonks, but we well and truly know that numbers cannot ever tell us the story of whether government commitments are taking life on the ground. Progress can only be measured and understood by centring the experiences and the perspectives of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people and their own deep insights as to what's changing and what's not. When I explain to you some of the key reforms that sit in this agreement, such as whether governments are sharing decision-making with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, whether there's Garma happening, that two-way learning that Garma means in Yolngu Mata, you will understand that that is not something that could ever be measured in numbers. So our focus is on what we have heard around Australia. We've met with 190 groups, and about 130 of those groups are Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander community people and organisations. We're only part of the way there. We haven't finished yet. Our next step is to engage with people who rarely get a voice in government, those whose voices are invisible to government policies and programs, but they are at the centre of the outcomes we're trying to achieve. We want to engage with people who've been in prison. We want to engage with kids who've been in youth detention. We want to engage with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander kids who have been removed from their family, culture and kin. And we want to hear whether there is real change and, in their eyes, how change can be achieved. I want to say up front, we are not a government agency. We're entirely independent. That said, we as an agency are not immune from the problems raised by our own report either. We are on our own Closing the Gap transformation. So many of you sitting here, I would imagine, have well and truly been hearing about the Closing the Gap agenda for the last 15 years. It's not a new agenda. And many of you would know that while there have been some changes over the last 15 years, for the most part, it's been pretty marginal. So let's go to the numbers for a minute, and then I'm going to leave the numbers where they stand. They don't tell the whole story, but they're a bit of an indicator of where things are at. And you heard the Prime Minister say today that we're really only moving forward on 4 out of the 19 targets in that agreement. 4 of them are going backwards, really serious ones. Fewer children are developmentally on track when starting school. And the rates of kids in out-of-home care, that is the number of kids removed from their family, their kin, their culture, has increased. Adults in prison, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in prison has increased. And the number of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people dying by suicide have increased. For the remainder of targets, which are all really critical, there's either no progress or so little progress that they literally won't be achieved by 2030, which is the deadline for the current agreement, unless there are drastic changes to the way government behaves. So these are today's figures. But back in 2020, when there was also no real movement on these figures, governments actually said, enough is enough. We have to do better. We can't keep doing what we've always been doing because it doesn't work. So in 2020, they jointly signed a radically different 10-year agreement on Closing the Gap. In this agreement, governments committed not just to targets, they committed to actually transforming themselves to share decision-making. They signed up to the agreement because they recognised that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people held the knowledge and the leadership about solutions and change for their own communities. So the centrepiece of this agreement is actually self-determination. That's what makes this agreement very different. There are 4 key reforms in this agreement. The first one that governments committed to doing was sharing decision-making with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. The second one was strengthening the Aboriginal community-controlled sector. The third one was that entire government transformation, which effectively is the enabler for those other 2. And the fourth one was about sharing data with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, one that many perceive as Indigenous data sovereignty, yet the words Indigenous data sovereignty are not used within the agreement. So that underlying anchor of the agreement, that self-determination, was also a recognition. It was almost like government said, in order for things to change, we as governments need to change. And if we don't do these things, if we don't enact these 4 reforms, we will never close the gap. They actually committed to empowering Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people to determine their own solutions and their futures. It wasn't just recognising the need for self-determination, it was governments committing to acting to activate it. Well, what we did here across the country from every quarter is that those 4 reforms are the right reforms. They are the ones that are going to get us to change. Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people told us that everywhere. But are governments delivering on those changes, those 4 reforms? No, not really. Yes, it's happening in pockets, but what we're seeing in large part is a hotted up version of business as usual. And the fact that only 4 targets are on track for change out of 19 probably reinforces that. And it doesn't seem to be for a lack of spoken commitment or intention. In fact, it would seem that that temperature is higher than it has ever been around this country. And it's not for a lack of action. There's actually a flurry of actions. Governments across Australia committed to over 2,000 actions to make those reforms happen. So why is it that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people can't feel or see those changes in reality? What we found is that most of those actions were really padded out with pre-existing actions, business that was just general government business rebadged. Some of them were only slightly relevant actions, some of them were just slight tweaks to the same old government processes, and in some of the cases we found that up to 70% of the actions that governments committed to change life outcomes for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people were just the existing ones rebadged. That's not to say there aren't places where good change is happening, but what is missing is that systemic underlying change demanded of governments by the agreement. And what is apparent is that governments haven't grasped the nature or scale of disruption to themselves and their old entrenched processes that are required to make this happen. We've certainly got a lot more of the right people sitting around the tables, and in practice, there definitely is a lot more joint partnership forums, but we're still seeing that business as usual approach to actual activation, the actions themselves. What do I mean by business as usual approach? At the operational level, we're seeing so many obstructions to that first priority reform. The power sharing at decision-making tables with government. So while some government agencies have proven willing to partner and share in decision-making, what we saw in large part was tokenistic consultation. It's easy to say the words sharing decision-making in practice, but when it comes to sharing power, this is where a lot of the government activity fell down. It doesn't seem to be that easy for governments to share power in practice, but that is what's demanded of them in this agreement. That is what they signed up to. In a lot of instances, what we saw was decision-making that alleged to be joint, but in fact it was consultation that happened within a week or 2 weeks of a deadline for a decision that had effectively already been made by governments. And the tacit message is, in these processes, that yes, we committed to the Garma, the two-way learning, yes, we committed to sharing decision-making, but actually, we as government know best. And that then obstructs a lot of the two-way learning that could scaffold a lot of the solutions that mob have come up with around the country. Widely across the NT and across Australia, we heard numerous instances where government agencies just would not relinquish control. So it appears that this is resting on those habitual and entrenched ways of government working on the ground. There might be that real leadership and mantra at the top for change, but when it comes to the operational level on the ground, that message and that change is not getting through. There's no disruption to behaviour, even though that's what's required of government. So digging behind this, shared decision-making requires 2 things. Firstly, it requires a baseline of trust. Well, we know across this country there's a history of breached promises by governments. That has to be acknowledged and it has to be addressed. The second thing it requires is for both sides sitting at a table to see each other as equals. And too often we saw around this country that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander organisations were seen as passive recipients of funding, lucky to receive the money that they did, instead of fundamental, indispensable partners to delivering outcomes for communities whom they hold the key to the best solutions. We saw some incredible examples where Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander organisations rejected this, and they changed the power dynamic by refusing funding from governments until governments came back and said, we need this service delivered. And those organisations said, you're requiring us to put a model of service, a solution that is designed for example, white metropolitan communities in Sydney, and put it out here with our mob. That's not going to work. That's going to make issues worse. The only basis on which we'll take this money is if we do it our way. So in those instances, that shared decision making was actually a pushback by mob who'd found a different way to change that power dynamic. Even without the compelling intrinsic value of self-determination, there's a very clear economic imperative. And I will put this in very simple terms because as a lawyer, I'm very clumsy with my economic language. But putting it really simply, if you continue to spend money on programs that don't align with what the community is telling you will work, with programs or solutions that are not measured in terms that the community value as markers of change, then you're spending government funds ineffectively in ways that could actually perpetuate demand. So we did keep asking ourselves the question, is there still something underlying bureaucratic and government decision making that says they know what's best for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities? Our review queries whether governments are truly open to putting their decisions and their operations under the microscope of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander eyes to hear, for example, where racism may infiltrate decision making. Now that is something they signed up to under this agreement. That third priority reform around transforming government is about identifying and eliminating racism. And for the most part, the only way we saw that acted upon was through initiatives to increase Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander employment. But the agreement asks governments to find the unconscious bias, find the blind spots in the way they work. And by definition, that's not something they can do themselves without the views of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. So what's holding governments to account for failing on this agreement, for not delivering what they signed up to? Well, accountability looms pretty large in the background of this agreement. The lack of it is one of the greatest barriers to progress. And the consequence for failures by governments here are actually very, very weak. This is evidenced, as you can see, by the fact that some governments are actually making decisions which blatantly contradict the agreement. For example, tough on crime, law and justice decisions that mean that more Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children and young people are locked up in custody than ever before. Some of them exacerbate rather than remedy disadvantage. So without better accountability mechanisms, we're very unlikely to see the transformative changes that the agreement calls for. So one of our key recommendations centres on a body to strengthen accountability. And you may have seen reports in the media saying that the Productivity Commission's calling for a big independent watchdog to hold governments accountable. Well, I'd just like to correct the record and say actually governments signed up to that already back in 2020. So there's a requirement in the agreement that an independent mechanism be set up to hold governments accountable for their own transformation to deliver this agreement. We're 3 years in and that mechanism has not come into being. So we're proposing that when it does, it's set up to hold governments accountable for the agreement in its entirety. So we'd love your feedback on that. Thank you. It's important that I talk about voice before I finish up. What's the role of the agreement if there is a voice, and what role should voice have in the agreement? That's a question that many people have been asking. Look, our job is solely to review progress by governments against the National Agreement on Closing the Gap. That is the limit of our scope, and voice is obviously a matter for the Australian people to decide. But when we look forward, we have, of course, thought about how the National Agreement on Closing the Gap would fit in a world where there is an Indigenous voice to Parliament. And we've actually suggested the voice could support holding governments to account under the agreement. Equally, if there's not a voice, there are a range of measures that should be adopted to hold governments accountable for what they signed up to. But we're clear that a voice should not replace the agreement and the obligations, the active obligations that governments have signed up to change themselves, to deeply change their own practices and unravel their own DNA. It's not a gloomy story. The agreement does show promise. There is hope. They're the right reforms for change. We saw plenty of evidence of that, where we saw huge changes in outcomes in kids staying with their families, in mental health outcomes where there was change. You could see a direct link between the implementation of these reforms and the life outcomes of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. But it's not across the board. And of course these reforms aren't easily implemented for governments, because it's not easy for governments to change their behaviours, but that's what they signed up to. And that requires a giant step out of the business as usual approach. It requires a major disruption to bureaucratic behaviour. There are serious consequences for failure to change the dial for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. Everybody here knows that. Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people continue to receive subpar public services and are directly impacted in negative ways by government policy. But it also matters to everybody in this country. We're all diminished when Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander kids don't reach their full potential. We're all worse off when governments waste money on things that they've agreed don't work. Thank you.